So why is it that we jump to conclusions so quickly? Why is it that a simple, unanswered text message can send us into a frenzy of confusion and sometimes even insecurity? Why is it that a rumor can spread faster than an official corporate communication? I have wrestled with those ideas for close to 30 years, and I've come to one conclusion, is that we live in a world, or at least we as humans have an innate inability to live in a world without story. And what I want to share with you here in the next few minutes is a psychological phenomenon that I've uncovered in my 30 years of working in behavioral neuroscience, and what I would say applied behavioral neuroscience. And understanding this phenomenon can help us understand why we love, why we fight, why we hate, and even why we grow and how we grow. And if you're able to master this, will not only transform how you communicate, but will also transform how you connect with the world. And I call it the narrative gap. Now, to understand the narrative gap, we understand this word, narrative, that we use a lot. It's become very, very popular recently. And I used to think the narrative just meant the narrative of a movie, something that I watched unfold. But the word narrative plays a very distinct role in the brain to play the role of what we call a construct of reality. Between the ages of 3 and 4, when we're kids, we use narrative to understand how the world works. Maybe a narrative for me is anything that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. My father's hungry, there's the beginning. He walks to the fridge and he consumes something, there's the middle. He's not hungry anymore, there's the end. And so when I'm hungry, engage in that narrative. And so as we grow, we realize between the ages of 9 to 13 that these narratives are driven by a set of values. Our brain actually formulates our values and locks in our values at ages 9 to 13 based on what we're surrounded by. So for some reason, this young boy is over to dinner every Sunday night in our home. And all I know as a kid that he's there. Come to find out later on that his parents weren't home. And when his parents weren't home, there was nobody to feed him. And so the narrative that I learned was, when Johnny's hungry, you invite him into your home. Now, by age 21, we solidify those values, not just situationally, but they become part of everything. Not just when Johnny's hungry, but when anyone's hungry, you invite them into your home. And so this whole idea of narrative, I can intellectualize with you all day long, but I want to play a game with you. And so if you would, I know we're not supposed to have our phones out, but I would invite everybody to pull your phones out for just a minute and then turn it face down. This is a really important piece. So take your phones out, and let's see how well you pay attention. Can you think about, in your phone, when you open it up, all of the apps, what is the app in the upper left-hand corner? Do you remember it? Now take a quick peek, and then take your phones and place it down again. And let's see how accurate you were. If you're like me, we look at our phones every day. Can you remember what it was? But here's a different question. If you're like every other phone out there, the first thing you see when you look at your phone is the time. Do you remember what time it is? Now, here you were looking for the app, you passed right by a piece of information in search of what you were looking for, and maybe you missed the most important piece. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, René, you tricked me, you had me look for something else, so we're going to play another game, and I'm telling you right now, I'm going to trick you, because I want to see how well you pay attention. And so let's see how well you pay attention. I'm going to invite everybody in the back, all of you to play along with me, and let's see how well you pay attention. Let's see if you can put your hands out in front of you like this, and I need your thumbs in the air. And I am watching because I can see if you're paying attention. I need your thumbs in the air, and I'll take your thumbs and point them down. And remember, I need you to do exactly as I do. Your right hand, I need you to put it in the air. And this is the hard part. Cross it over and interlace your fingers. Now, I need your right thumb to be placed out. I see some left thumbs out there. Make sure your right thumb is out there. Perfect. Now, point your fingers out like this and tap them together. And if you've been paying attention to everything that I've done, you should be able to do as I do next, which is this. Now, kind of wild, isn't it? So now, here's what I learned when somebody first did that to me, that there's a difference between what I visually see and what I'm paying attention to. And that what vision and attention are two very different pieces in how the brain works. And so right now, you might be wondering, okay, what happened? See, your brain is searching for a story. It's searching for a narrative. You might say, well, he must have moved his hand. Well, maybe I missed this, or maybe I wasn't paying attention. But I want you to pay attention to what happens in the brain, because to understand narrative, you have to understand this moment that just came over you right now. Here I was in the middle of a presentation, And I stopped. I looked off screen. And the lesson is actually inside of you. What did your brain do immediately? Because here I was in this narrative. I'm on stage. I'm here at the conference. And René's talking about this. And all of a sudden, that narrative stops. And there's a gap in the story. He wasn't talking anymore. And then he picks up and talks. But what did your brains do with that gap? Immediately, it filled it. My assumption is some level of stress, some question, what happened? But maybe some of you thought, well, maybe he forgot something. Maybe he heard something over here. Maybe he was distracted. Who knows what it was? But what matters is your brain couldn't handle that gap. And the reason it couldn't handle it is because, remember, a narrative is a construct of reality. And so the narrative in the story that's unfolding as me on stage, when it stops, your brain has to fill it almost instantly just to make sense of what's happening. Now, the crazy thing is that if that's a construct of reality, isn't reality just reality? I mean, isn't reality the thing that we all understand, and why wouldn't it be the same for all of us? That's probably the biggest question. Where we're having this conversation, we're saying, okay, well, there's these gaps and our brains filled it to construct reality, but why wasn't it all the same? So let's pretend that we all work for the same company, and our leader doesn't show up. Somebody over here says, oh, John didn't show up again today? He's out probably buying another yacht. I don't know how many yachts he needs. There's one way to fill the gap. But somebody over here says, hold on a second, John didn't show up? Let me call him and see if he's okay. So here we have the same exact scenario, and one person goes to an assumption of greed and a yacht, another chases the assumption of empathy and concern, constructing two coexisting realities. Now this is what boggled my mind to say, wait, I thought reality was reality. How can we have two coexisting realities? And so I had to dig a little bit further and to say, okay, why did we choose two different realities? And what I came from is that we had different sources to choose the assumption. This person over here that went to greed and a yacht, maybe last year he was trying to negotiate with his leader, and the leader said, we don't have the budget for that project, and next week he's out on his yacht taking selfies. And all he can think about is that, well, he didn't have the budget for me, but he had it for himself, and he took that assumption and placed it in the narrative timeline. But why did the person over here go to empathy and concern? Well, maybe this person knew the leader's story, and that maybe his daughter was sick and in the hospital. And before the meeting, he said, yep, I'll be at the meeting after I see my daughter and make sure she's okay. He didn't show up, and naturally, this person pulled from that story, not from their own, to fill in that gap, to understand a reality in a very different way. Now, for me, what's equally fascinating and sometimes terrifying is how many gaps are happening in our reality all the time. How many gaps are happening in our narrative? How many stories are left untold, making and forcing us, remember this is neurologically based, to fill in that gap. And when I look at that, it's thousands. I tested this theory during COVID, where leaders and all of us were forced to separate, forcing these gaps to happen. And I thought back to 50 plus years ago, where most people lived in very tight-knit communities, at least where I'm from. If you went to school, you saw your teachers, but then you went to work, and the people that you work with, maybe in the grocery store next to you. If you went to get a haircut when I used to have hair, the person next to me was probably somebody I worked with. Maybe my kids were in Little League, they were coached by my boss. And so I had time to be in front of them. I saw the facial expressions and the micro expressions and the nuances. I knew just by the length of time it took them to communicate something, or the lack of communication, what it meant. And then we started progressing in technology, transportation, communication. And we start willingly moving further and further apart from these once tight-knit communities. And we did that with a consoling illusion that we still knew each other. Well, of course I know who they are. I look at my phone, I can see when they've logged in, I can see what they're doing, our productivity is great. I know how they're doing. But have I had any human connection with them? And we realized is that we were starting to lose in this advancement of technology, this human connection. We're here talking about human capability, but have we begun to lose some of that as we evolve from a technology perspective? And so when we look at this narrative and the gaps that were being created, I realized that this is an opportune time for us to realize just how these stories, our understanding of reality, is created. And I was left with a question. What's the answer? And when I look at that story of the person with the greed and a yacht and empathy and concern, I realized the answer is that if the leader does not share their story, it forces everyone else to pick from their own experience to fill in the gaps of reality. And when I realized that, I realized that the less I communicate, the less I share my story, the more I leave to chance people's understanding of who I was. Now, add on to that all of the cognitive biases like negativity bias and all of confirmation bias and all these biases that drive our human behavior unconsciously. I realized that I didn't want that to be the case. And so part of why I share all of this is today, in a world that is so disconnected, I can't imagine a more important time for us to share story and who we are, and understand that the narrative is being driven by so many different entities that understand the power of this, whether it be politics, whether it be the media, whether it be us. I know for myself, when I look at this gap driven by an assumption created from a source, I have to ask myself the question, if I have multiple sources fighting for that narrative, who am I going to believe? Who am I going to trust? And that is the question. Because when we think about influence, when we think about communication, connection, it comes down to who are the people that we trust to be the sources of the assumptions to fill the gaps in our narrative and reality. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge, is to go beyond the technology and beyond these pieces and to share who we are. And so I want to leave you with this idea. It's a very simple idea, is that every one of us is a walking collection of the narrative gaps that people have filled for us. And that every single person in this room is full of stories and experiences that somebody might never know or might never get access to. And so in this world that is defined by disconnection, maybe, just maybe, our greatest human capability might be this: that in every silence between us, every miscommunication, every gap in the narrative or reality, there lies a choice. And that choice comes down to, what story do we fill that gap with? And so my challenge would be that maybe we choose a story that is not of fear, but of hope. Not a story of suspicion, but a story of generosity. Not a story of hate, but a story of love. And not a story that protects us, but maybe a story that connects us. And my last challenge would be for you to think back to all of the relationships, the people that you love, the people that you work with, and to ask yourself, what stories are filling the gaps for you? Are they stories that are building walls, or are they building bridges? And we know that we need to intentionally fill those gaps, because if we don't, they will be filled by someone else. Because in the end of the day, we become the stories that we choose to believe. Thank you.